The winter of 1932 arrived in Mercy Hollow like an unwanted guest, cold and unforgiving. Snow fell in thick, suffocating blankets over the small farming community nestled in the Appalachian hills of eastern Kentucky. The roads became impassable, the trains stopped running, and in that isolation, something terrible was taking root behind the walls of a modest white farmhouse at the edge of town. Mercy Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. With barely 300 souls calling it home, the town consisted of a general store, a Baptist church with a crooked steeple, a one-room schoolhouse, and a scattering of farms connected by dirt roads that turned to mud in spring and froze solid in winter. The Great Depression had hit these hills hard. Men stood in line for government relief. Women stretched every penny until it screamed. Children went to bed hungry more nights than not, but the Thornton family seemed untouched by the hardships that plagued their neighbors. Samuel Thornton owned one of the largest farms in the county, with over 200 acres of fertile land, a dozen dairy cows, chickens, pigs, and fields that produced corn and tobacco, even in the worst years. He was a man of means in a time when most had nothing. Samuel was 48 years old in that winter of 1932, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look right through you. His hair had gone completely gray by the time he turned 40, and he wore it slicked back with pomade, always neat, always controlled. He dressed in dark suits even when working the fields, as if he were perpetually attending a funeral. His hands were large and rough, the hands of a man who had worked the land his entire life, but there was something delicate about the way he moved them, almost reverent, like a preacher handling a Bible. He rarely smiled. When he spoke, which wasn't often, his voice came out in a low rumble that made people lean in to hear him. He attended church every Sunday without fail, sitting in the front pew with his family, his head bowed in prayer longer than anyone else. Reverend Mitchell often praised Samuel as a pillar of the community, a God-fearing man who understood the importance of moral virtue in these corrupt times. Samuel's wife, Margaret, had died 6 years earlier from pneumonia. The town remembered her as a quiet, nervous woman who jumped at shadows and rarely looked anyone in the eye. Some of the older women whispered that they had seen bruises on her arms, but in those days what happened between a man and his wife was considered private business. Margaret left behind 3 daughters, Ruth, Esther, and Naomi. Ruth was the eldest at 19. She had her mother's delicate features, pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the winter light, and long auburn hair that she wore in a tight braid down her back. She had been engaged to a young man named Thomas Webb, a farmhand from a neighboring county, but Samuel had broken off the engagement 2 years prior. No one knew exactly why. Thomas had seemed like a decent fellow, hard-working and respectful, but Samuel had sent him away and forbidden Ruth from ever seeing him again. After that, Ruth became even quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped attending the church socials. She stopped going into town. She became a ghost in her own life. Esther was 17, the middle daughter, and the only one who seemed to have inherited any fire from somewhere in the family line. She had dark hair and fierce green eyes that challenged anyone who looked at her too long. She helped her father with the farm work, often doing the labor of 2 men, hauling water, feeding animals, mending fences. She wore her brother's old clothes, pants and work shirts that scandalized some of the more traditional families in Mercy Hollow. But Samuel allowed it, perhaps because Esther was the most useful to him, or perhaps because he had already broken her spirit in ways that weren't visible to outsiders. Naomi was the youngest at 15. She was small and thin, with blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed too large for her face. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice came out in barely a whisper. The school teacher, Miss Caroline Porter, had expressed concern about Naomi to the school board the previous year. The girl was bright, one of the best students, but she flinched at sudden movements and often had dark circles under her eyes as if she never slept. Miss Porter had even visited the Thornton farm once to speak with Samuel about Naomi's well-being, but Samuel had received her on the porch, never inviting her inside, and assured her in that low, rumbling voice that his daughters were perfectly fine, that they were simply being raised with proper discipline and Christian values. The first sign that something was wrong came on a bitter cold morning in late January. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, who ran the general store with her husband, noticed that no one from the Thornton family had been into town for nearly 3 weeks. This was unusual. Even in the worst weather, Samuel would send one of his daughters to pick up supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil. But the store ledger showed no purchases under the Thornton name since early January. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned this to her husband, who shrugged it off. "They've got a big farm," he said. "Probably stocked up before the snow hit." But Abigail Fletcher had a nose for trouble, honed by 40 years of watching the comings and goings of a small town. Something felt wrong. She mentioned it to Reverend Mitchell after Sunday service. He stroked his white beard thoughtfully and said he would pay a pastoral visit to the Thornton farm just to check on the family. That afternoon, he rode his horse through the snow-covered roads to the white farmhouse at the edge of town. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The farmhouse looked abandoned. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the freezing temperature. The windows were dark. The livestock in the barn were bellowing and had clearly not been fed or watered in days. Reverend Mitchell knocked on the front door. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. He tried the door and found it unlocked. The smell hit him first. Something metallic and wrong. The house was freezing inside, colder than the air outside. The furniture was in place, but everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. In the kitchen, food sat rotting on the table, a meal that had been prepared but never eaten. The Reverend called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Samuel, girls, is anyone home?" Silence. He searched the downstairs and found nothing. Then he climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The first 2 bedrooms were empty, the beds neatly made. But when he opened the door to the 3rd bedroom, the master bedroom where Samuel slept, he found him. Samuel Thornton sat in a rocking chair by the window, dressed in his Sunday suit, his hands folded in his lap. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. At first, Reverend Mitchell thought he was in some kind of trance, but when he approached and touched Samuel's shoulder, the body was cold and stiff. Samuel Thornton had been dead for at least several days, but where were his daughters? Reverend Mitchell stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. He called out for Ruth, Esther, and Naomi, searching every room, every closet, every corner of that dark house. They were nowhere to be found. He ran outside, checked the barn, the shed, the smokehouse. Nothing. The 3 young women had vanished. He rode back to town as fast as his horse could carry him through the snow. Within an hour, Sheriff Thomas Brennan had assembled a search party. A dozen men rode out to the Thornton farm, and what they discovered in those first hours of the investigation would shock the entire region and remain unsolved for decades. In the barn, they found fresh digging. Someone had been excavating in the dirt floor despite the frozen ground. There were shovels leaning against the wall, the blades still caked with soil. And in Samuel's bedroom, in a locked drawer of his desk, they found a leather-bound journal filled with pages of tight, cramped handwriting. The first entry was dated 3 years earlier, and it began with the words that would become infamous in the annals of American cold cases. "God has given me a sacred duty. I must protect my daughters from the corruption of this world. I must keep them pure, no matter the cost." The journal entries became increasingly disturbing, filled with religious mania, paranoid accusations about men in town trying to seduce his daughters, and detailed plans for what he called the final protection. But the journal ended abruptly 2 weeks before his death, with no clear explanation of what he had done or where the girls had gone. Sheriff Brennan stood in that cold farmhouse, the journal trembling in his hands, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Something terrible had happened here, something that defied logic and decency. But as he looked out at the snow-covered fields stretching toward the dark tree line, he had no idea where to begin searching for the truth. and in the silence of Mercy Hollow, the whispers had already begun. The news of Samuel Thornton's death and the disappearance of his 3 daughters spread through Mercy Hollow like wildfire through dry grass. By nightfall on that January day, every household in the county knew something terrible had happened at the Thornton farm. Women clutched their children closer. Men gathered in hushed circles at the general store, their faces grim and troubled. And Sheriff Thomas Brennan knew he was facing the most difficult investigation of his career. Brennan was 52 years old, a veteran of the Great War who had seen horrors in the trenches of France that still haunted his dreams. He had returned home in 1919 and taken the position of county sheriff, expecting to deal with nothing more serious than the occasional drunk and disorderly or property dispute. But this case was different. This case felt evil. The morning after the discovery, Brennan assembled every able-bodied man in the county. Over 40 volunteers showed up at the Thornton farm at dawn, armed with shovels, picks, and lanterns. The temperature had dropped below 0 overnight, and their breath came out in white clouds as they stood in the frozen yard, waiting for instructions. "We're looking for 3 missing girls," Brennan announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Ruth, 19. Esther, 17. Naomi, 15. We found evidence of digging in the barn, so that's where we start. But I want every inch of this property searched. The house, the outbuildings, the fields, the woods beyond. If they're here, we're going to find them." What Sheriff Brennan didn't tell the volunteers was what he had read in Samuel Thornton's journal the night before. He had sat up until 3 in the morning, reading every word of that cramped handwriting by lamplight, and what he discovered had made his blood run cold. The journal revealed a man descending into madness over the course of 3 years. The early entries were relatively normal, prayers and Bible verses, observations about the farm and the weather. But after Margaret's death in 1926, something had broken inside Samuel Thornton. He began to write about visions from God, about angels visiting him in his dreams, warning him that the world was becoming corrupt and sinful. He became obsessed with the idea that men were trying to defile his daughters. When Ruth's engagement to Thomas Webb was announced, Samuel's writings became frantic. He described Thomas as a serpent in human form and an agent of Satan sent to destroy purity. He broke off the engagement and forbade Ruth from ever leaving the property without his supervision. The journal entries showed his control over his daughters tightening like a noose. He removed them from school. He stopped allowing them to attend church socials. He monitored every conversation, every letter, every moment of their lives. But it was the final entries that truly disturbed Sheriff Brennan. In November of 1931, just 3 months before his death, Samuel had written, "The Lord has shown me the way. If I cannot protect them in this world, I will protect them for eternity. They will remain pure. They will remain mine. No man will ever touch them. No corruption will ever reach them." And then, 2 weeks before his death, the last entry. "It is done. They are safe now. Protected forever. God forgive me for what I had to do to save them." Sheriff Brennan had immediately focused on the barn, where the fresh digging had been found. That morning, as the sun rose over the frozen landscape, a team of men began excavating the dirt floor of the barn. The ground was hard as concrete from the cold, and progress was slow. They worked in shifts, pounding pickaxes into the frozen earth, then shoveling away the loosened soil. By noon, they had dug down 4 feet and found nothing. By mid-afternoon, 6 feet. Still nothing. Some of the volunteers were beginning to think they were searching in the wrong place. But Sheriff Brennan had a terrible certainty in his gut. He had seen enough death in the war to recognize the smell that lingered faintly in that barn, a smell that the cold couldn't quite mask. "Keep digging," he ordered. At 7 feet down, just as the last light was fading from the sky, one of the shovels hit something solid. Not rock, something else. The men scraped away the soil carefully, and what they uncovered made several of them turn away, their faces pale. Wooden boards. Someone had constructed a crude chamber beneath the barn floor using old lumber and nails. The boards were still relatively fresh, not rotted. They had been placed there recently within the last few months. Sheriff Brennan's hands shook as he helped pry away the boards with a crowbar. The smell that rose from below was unmistakable now. Sweet and sickly, the odor of decay. One of the volunteers vomited. Another started praying out loud. Brennan lowered a lantern into the darkness below and saw what he had been dreading. 3 bodies. 3 young women lying side by side in the narrow space, dressed in white nightgowns, their hands folded across their chests as if they were sleeping. But they weren't sleeping. They had been dead for weeks, possibly months. "Get them out," Brennan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carefully, with respect. It took another hour to excavate the chamber enough to safely remove the bodies. As they lifted the first girl into the lamplight, Mrs. Darrow, Abigail Fletcher, who had insisted on being present despite Brennan's protests, let out a wail of anguish. She recognized the auburn hair and pale features. It was Ruth, the eldest daughter. The second body was Esther, still wearing the same fierce expression even in death, her green eyes closed. And the third was little Naomi, so small and fragile, looking even younger than her 15 years. Dr. Edward Harrison, the county medical examiner, arrived just before midnight. He was an elderly man with trembling hands and thick spectacles, but he was the only qualified doctor within 50 miles. Sheriff Brennan helped him load the bodies into his wagon, and they transported them to the small clinic in town, where Harrison conducted his examinations. Brennan didn't go home that night. He sat in the clinic's waiting room, drinking black coffee and trying to process what he had found. At 4 a.m, Dr. Harrison emerged from the examination room, looking 20 years older than when he had entered. "Sheriff," he said, sitting down heavily in the chair beside Brennan. "I've been a doctor for 37 years. I've seen disease, accidents, and violence, but I've never seen anything like this." "Tell me," Brennan said. Dr. Harrison took off his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a nervous gesture. "Based on the state of decomposition and the temperature they were stored at, I estimate they died sometime in early December, roughly 6 to 8 weeks ago. The cause of death for all 3 appears to be asphyxiation." "Asphyxiation," Brennan repeated. "They suffocated?" "Yes. But here's what's truly disturbing. There are no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds on their hands or arms, no trauma to their bodies. It's as if they simply laid down and stopped breathing." Brennan felt his stomach turn. Could they have been poisoned first, drugged? Possibly. I'll need to send tissue samples to the state laboratory in Louisville for a proper toxicology analysis, but that will take weeks, maybe months. What I can tell you is this. Those girls were placed in that chamber while they were still alive, or very recently deceased. The chamber was then sealed from above, if they were alive when he put them down there. Harrison's voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Then they woke up buried alive," Brennan finished for him. The 2 men sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of that horror settling over them like a physical thing. Finally, Brennan spoke again. "Could he have given them something to make them sleep? Something that would keep them unconscious?" "It's possible. Laudanum, morphine, even certain plant extracts could induce a deep sleep. If he gave them a large enough dose, they might never have woken up at all. That would explain the lack of defensive wounds. But without a proper toxicology report, I'm only speculating." Sheriff Brennan stood up and walked to the window. Dawn was beginning to break over Mercy Hollow, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if he could see anything but those 3 girls lying in their white nightgowns. "What kind of father does this to his own children?" he said, not really expecting an answer. Dr. Harrison put his spectacles back on and looked at Brennan with tired, sad eyes. A father who's completely lost his mind. A father who convinced himself he was doing the right thing. Samuel Thornton's journal suggests he believed he was protecting them, saving them from something worse than death. In his twisted logic, he was being merciful. Merciful! Brennan spat the word like poison. There's nothing merciful about what he did. Over the next week, Sheriff Brennan conducted a thorough investigation of Samuel Thornton's final months. He interviewed everyone who had any contact with the family. He examined the farmhouse inch by inch, looking for clues. He sent the journal to a psychiatrist in Cincinnati who specialized in religious mania. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been planning his daughter's deaths for months. Samuel had purchased large quantities of laudanum from 3 different pharmacies in 3 different towns, claiming it was for his own sleep troubles. He had constructed the underground chamber in the barn over the course of several weeks, working only at night when no one would see. He had prepared 3 white nightgowns, stitched by hand with careful, precise stitches. And on a night in early December, according to the timeline Brennan reconstructed, Samuel had likely drugged his daughter's evening meal with the laudanum. As they became drowsy and confused, he would have helped them change into the white nightgowns, told them to lie down, told them they were going to sleep, and when they woke up, everything would be better. He then carried them one by one to the barn and placed them in the chamber he had prepared. He sealed the wooden boards over them and filled in the grave, packing the dirt down tight. The psychiatrist's report confirmed what everyone already suspected. Samuel Thornton had suffered from a severe mental breakdown, likely exacerbated by the isolation, the death of his wife, and an obsessive religious fervor that warped into delusion. He had convinced himself that the only way to keep his daughters pure was to ensure no man could ever touch them, and the only way to guarantee that was through death. After completing what he believed was his sacred duty, Samuel had apparently returned to his house, dressed in his Sunday best, and sat down in his rocking chair to wait for death. The medical examiner determined he had died of heart failure, likely brought on by the extreme stress and guilt of what he had done, combined with his age and poor health. In his final moments, Samuel Thornton had simply closed his eyes, and his heart had stopped beating. The funerals were held on a gray February morning. The entire town turned out to pay their respects to Ruth, Esther, and Naomi. Reverend Mitchell delivered a eulogy that brought tears to every eye in the church. The 3 sisters were buried side by side in the Mercy Hollow Cemetery, their graves marked with simple white crosses. Samuel Thornton was buried in an unmarked grave at the far edge of the cemetery, away from everyone else. No one spoke at his burial. No prayers were said. He was simply placed in the ground and covered with dirt, his name already becoming something people would rather forget. But the questions remained. Had the girls known what their father was planning? Had they suspected anything in those final days? Or had they trusted him completely, right up until the moment they fell asleep for the last time? The journal provided no answers to these questions, and the dead could not speak. Sheriff Brennan closed the case officially in March of 1932, ruling it a triple murder followed by the natural death of the perpetrator. But he never stopped thinking about those 3 girls, and the terrible love that had destroyed them. In the weeks following the discovery at the Thornton farm, Sheriff Brennan continued to dig deeper into the family's history. What he uncovered suggested that the tragedy might not have been as sudden as it first appeared. There had been warning signs, whispers in the community, moments when someone might have intervened if only they had understood what was happening behind the walls of that white farmhouse. The first person Brennan interviewed in depth was Miss Caroline Porter, the schoolteacher who had expressed concern about Naomi the year before. She was a thin woman of 35 with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She met with Brennan in the empty schoolhouse on a Saturday afternoon, and what she told him made his chest tighten with anger and grief. "I should have done more," Miss Porter said, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. "I knew something was wrong. I could see it in that child's eyes every single day." "Tell me everything you remember," Brennan said gently. Miss Porter took a deep breath. "Naomi was brilliant, one of the smartest students I've ever taught. She could recite entire passages from books after reading them just once. She solved mathematics problems that children twice her age struggled with. but she was terrified of making mistakes. If she got even one answer wrong on an assignment, she would become physically ill. I once saw her break down in tears because she had misspelled a single word. Did she ever talk about her home life? Never directly. But there were signs. She flinched when anyone raised their voice, even in normal conversation. She never brought lunch to school, and when I offered to share mine, she refused, saying her father didn't allow her to accept food from strangers. In winter, she wore the same threadbare coat every day, even though I knew her father was one of the wealthiest men in the county. Miss Porter set down her teacup and looked directly at Brennan. But the incident that truly alarmed me happened in October of 1930. We were reading a story in class about a girl who runs away from home to join the circus. It was meant to be a light-hearted tale about adventure and independence. But when I looked up from the book, Naomi was crying silently at her desk, tears streaming down her face. After class, I asked her what was wrong. She said, "Miss Porter, do you think it's possible for someone to run away and never be found?" I asked her why she would ask such a question, and she just shook her head and said, "Never mind. Father says running away is a sin." "And that's when you visited the farm?" "Yes, the very next day." I was so worried about her. When I arrived, Mr. Thornton met me on the porch. He wouldn't let me inside the house. He stood there in his dark suit, looking down at me with those cold eyes, and told me that his daughters were being raised according to God's law, and that I had no business interfering. I tried to explain that I was only concerned about Naomi's well-being, but he cut me off. He said, and I'll never forget his exact words, "The world is full of corruption, Miss Porter. I keep my daughters safe from it. That is my duty as their father and their protector." "Did you see Naomi or her sisters while you were there?" "No, but I heard something. As I was leaving, I heard singing. It was coming from somewhere inside the house, very faint. A hymn. It sounded like multiple voices singing in harmony, but there was something wrong about it. It sounded mechanical, lifeless, like they were singing without really hearing the words. It gave me chills." Miss Porter wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. I reported my concerns to the school board, but they dismissed me. They said Samuel Thornton was a respected member of the community and that I was overstepping my bounds. I even spoke to Reverend Mitchell, and he assured me that Samuel was a devout Christian man who would never harm his children. I believed him. God help me, I believed him, and I let it go. Brennan's next interview was with Thomas Webb, the young man who had been engaged to Ruth before Samuel broke it off. Thomas was now 24, working as a farmhand on a property 30 miles from Mercy Hollow. When Brennan tracked him down, he found a man who had clearly been carrying a heavy burden of guilt. Thomas was tall and lean, with sandy hair and a weathered face that made him look older than his years. He invited Brennan into the small cabin where he lived alone and offered him coffee. They sat at a rough wooden table, and Thomas stared into his cup for a long moment before speaking. "I loved Ruth," he said quietly. "I loved her from the first moment I saw her at a church social in the summer of 1928. She was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen, but it wasn't just her looks. She was kind and gentle and had this way of seeing the good in everything. When she smiled, it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds." "How did you meet?" "We were both at a barn raising for the Peterson family. Ruth was helping serve lemonade to the workers. I worked up the courage to talk to her, and we spent the whole afternoon together. After that, I found excuses to ride past the Thornton farm. Sometimes Ruth would be outside feeding the chickens or hanging laundry, and we'd talk through the fence. Her father didn't know about it at first." Thomas's jaw tightened. "We courted for almost a year. I met her in secret mostly. We'd meet at the creek that ran between our properties, or at church socials when her father wasn't watching too closely. In the summer of 1929, I finally got the courage to ask her to marry me. She said yes. She was so happy, Mr. Brennan. I'd never seen her so happy." "What happened when you asked her father for permission?" "He said yes at first. That's what was so strange. When I rode to the Thornton farm and formally asked for Ruth's hand, Samuel Thornton looked at me for a long time with those dead eyes of his, and then he nodded. He said, "You may marry her, but not for 2 years. She's too young yet. When she turns 20, you may have her." I agreed. 2 years seemed like forever, but I would have waited 10 if it meant I could marry Ruth. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, his back to Brennan. But then things started to change. Samuel began making excuses for why Ruth couldn't see me. She was ill. She was needed at home. She was busy with chores. The few times I did manage to speak with her, she seemed different, scared, nervous. She wouldn't look me in the eye. Finally, in January of 1930, Samuel sent me a letter. It said the engagement was off. Ruth had changed her mind. She had decided that marriage was not part of God's plan for her life. Did you believe that? Thomas turned back to face Brennan, and there were tears in his eyes. No, I knew Ruth. She wouldn't have changed her mind like that. So I rode to the farm to talk to her myself. Samuel met me at the property line with a shotgun. He told me if I ever came back, if I ever tried to contact Ruth again, he would have me arrested for trespassing. He said Ruth was his daughter, and she would remain his until God called her home. Did you try to reach her again? I tried writing letters, but they were returned unopened. I tried talking to Reverend Mitchell, but he said I needed to respect Samuel's wishes. I even considered going to the sheriff, but what would I have said? That a father had forbidden his daughter from marrying me? That wasn't illegal, so I moved away. I thought maybe if I gave it time, Ruth would find a way to contact me, but she never did, and now I know why. Thomas sat back down at the table, his hands clenched into fists. He took her from me, Sheriff. He took her and her sisters because he couldn't stand the thought of them belonging to anyone but him. And I should have fought harder. I should have found a way to save her. "This wasn't your fault, son," Brennan said. "Wasn't it? I gave up on her. I walked away when she needed someone to fight for her. What kind of man does that make me?" Brennan had no answer for him. The third interview that haunted Brennan was with Mrs. Helen Grayson, a widow who lived on the neighboring property to the Thorntons. She was 72 years old, nearly deaf, and half blind, but her mind was sharp as a tack. She invited Brennan into her small cottage and served him apple pie while she talked. "I heard things," Mrs. Grayson said, cutting a generous slice of pie. "Late at night, when the world was quiet, I heard things coming from that farm that made my blood run cold." "What kind of things?" "Crying. A girl crying like her heart was breaking. This was maybe 2-3 years ago. I couldn't sleep one night because of the wind, so I was sitting by my window with a cup of warm milk, and I heard it carried on the breeze. It went on for hours. I almost walked over there myself, but my legs aren't what they used to be, and it was the middle of the night. The next morning I mentioned it to Samuel when I saw him at church. I said, "I heard one of your girls crying last night. I hope everything's all right." You know what he said to me?" Brennan shook his head. He said, "You're mistaken, Mrs. Grayson. My daughters were sleeping peacefully all night. Perhaps it was a fox or an owl you heard. But I know the difference between an animal and a human being in pain, Sheriff. I'm old, but I'm not senile. Did you hear anything else over the years?" Mrs. Grayson nodded slowly. "Digging. Last November, maybe early December, I heard digging sounds coming from the Thornton property at night. I thought maybe Samuel was digging a new well or working on his root cellar. It went on for several nights, and then, right around Christmas, everything went silent. I didn't hear any sounds from that farm at all. No animals, no voices, nothing. It was like the whole place had been swallowed up by the earth." She leaned forward, her cloudy eyes fixed on Brennan. "And one more thing, Sheriff. In early January, just before you found Samuel dead, I saw lights in the barn late at night. Just for a few minutes. It looked like lamplight moving around inside, and then it went dark, and I never saw lights over there again." These interviews painted a picture that made Brennan sick to his stomach. The signs had been there. Multiple people had noticed something was wrong. But the walls of privacy around a man's family were so thick in those days that no one had felt they could truly intervene. And 3 innocent girls had paid the ultimate price for that silence. But there was one more person Brennan needed to talk to, someone who had been closer to the Thorntons than anyone else in the final years. Martha Simmons had been the family's housekeeper until Samuel had dismissed her in the fall of 1931, just months before the tragedy. It took Brennan 3 weeks to track her down. She had moved to Cincinnati to live with her sister and was working in a textile factory. When Brennan finally sat down with Martha in her sister's small apartment, he found a woman who looked haunted, her eyes carrying shadows that went deeper than mere exhaustion from factory work. Martha Simmons was 43 years old, a sturdy woman with graying hair and hands roughened by years of hard work. She sat across from Sheriff Brennan in her sister's cramped Cincinnati apartment, a cup of untouched tea growing cold between her trembling fingers. Outside, the sounds of the city rumbled through the thin walls, cars honking, people shouting, the clang of streetcars. But inside that small room, there was only heavy silence and the weight of terrible secrets. "I knew," Martha said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "God help me, Sheriff. I knew something horrible was going to happen, and I didn't stop it." Brennan leaned forward in his chair. "Tell me everything, Martha, from the beginning." Martha took a shaky breath and began. "I started working for the Thorntons in 1927, a year after Mrs. Margaret passed. Samuel needed help with the house and the girls. At first it seemed like a good position. The pay was fair, and the girls were sweet children. Ruth was 13 then, Esther 11, and little Naomi only 9. They were so full of life, Sheriff. They would laugh and play and sing together. The house felt warm, despite Samuel's cold presence. When did things start to change? Gradually at first, then all at once. Samuel had always been strict, but after his wife died, something broke inside him. He started reading the Bible constantly, obsessively. He would make the girls sit for hours while he read scripture to them, not the gentle passages about love and forgiveness, but the harsh ones about punishment and sin and eternal judgment. If one of them fidgeted or lost focus, he would make them stand in the corner for hours, praying for forgiveness. Martha's hands clenched around the teacup. He became obsessed with the idea that the world was trying to corrupt his daughters. He stopped letting them go to town. He took them out of school. He forbade them from talking to anyone outside the family except when absolutely necessary. He would inspect their clothing to make sure it was modest enough. He read every letter they received and supervised every conversation they had. What about Ruth's engagement to Thomas Webb? That was the beginning of the end, Martha said, her eyes distant with memory. When Ruth first told her father about Thomas, I thought Samuel might actually be pleased. Thomas was a good young man, respectful and hard-working. But I saw something change in Samuel's face when Ruth said she loved Thomas. It was like a door slamming shut. He agreed to the engagement, but I could tell it was eating away at him. I started noticing him watching Ruth constantly, following her with his eyes whenever she moved around the house. And he began talking to himself, muttering prayers under his breath. One night I was cleaning the kitchen late, and I heard him in his study. He was talking to someone, having a full conversation, but when I peeked in, he was alone. He was kneeling in front of a candle, speaking to empty air, as if God himself was standing there giving him instructions. Brennan felt a chill run down his spine. What was he saying? He was asking for guidance. He kept saying, "How do I keep them pure? How do I protect them from evil?" And then he would pause, as if listening to a response, and nod his head. "Yes, I understand. I know what I must do. They must remain mine forever. No man can have them. No man can defile them." It terrified me, Sheriff. But I told myself I was overreacting, that he was just a grieving widower struggling with the idea of his daughter leaving home. Martha set down her teacup and wrapped her arms around herself. Then came the day Samuel broke off Ruth's engagement. I was in the house when Thomas Webb's letter arrived, the one telling Ruth he would wait for her, that he loved her and would count down the days until their wedding. Ruth was so happy reading that letter, Sheriff. Her face lit up like sunshine. But Samuel snatched it from her hands and read it himself. The look on his face was like nothing I'd ever seen, pure rage mixed with something else, something possessive and dark. He called Ruth into his study and closed the door. I could hear them talking, though I couldn't make out the words. When Ruth came out an hour later, her face was pale and her eyes were red from crying. Samuel called me in next and told me he was breaking off the engagement. He said God had revealed to him that Thomas Webb was unworthy, that no man was worthy of his daughters, and that Ruth would remain at home where she belonged. After that, everything got worse. Samuel dismissed the few remaining people who had any contact with the family. He fired the farmhands who helped with the heavy work. He stopped attending church regularly, saying the congregation was full of sinners and hypocrites. And the girls, those poor girls, they became like ghosts. They moved through the house silently, afraid to speak, afraid to laugh, afraid to exist too loudly. Brennan asked the question he had been dreading. When did you realize he was planning something? Martha's eyes filled with tears. September of 1931. I found drawings in Samuel's study, architectural sketches of some kind of underground room. There were measurements, calculations, notes about ventilation and depth. At first I thought maybe he was planning to build an expanded root cellar. But then I found his journal. I know I shouldn't have read it, but something told me I needed to know. The things he had written, Sheriff, they made my blood freeze. He talked about preserving purity through eternal rest. He wrote about how the only way to truly protect something precious was to put it somewhere no one could ever reach it. He wrote about his daughters sleeping forever, safe from the corruption of the world, pure and untouched until the day of judgment. I confronted him. I told him I had read his journal and that I was frightened by what I had seen. He looked at me with those cold, dead eyes and said, "You don't understand, Martha. You could never understand. God has given me a sacred mission. My daughters are too pure for this sinful world. I must preserve that purity at all costs." I asked him what he meant, and he simply said, "You're dismissed. Pack your things and leave my property immediately." I should have gone to the sheriff then, Martha sobbed. I should have told someone what I had read, what I had seen, but I was terrified. Samuel was a respected man in the community. Who would believe a housekeeper over him? I convinced myself I had misunderstood, that surely no father could do what I feared he was planning. So I took my wages, packed my belongings, and left. I moved to Cincinnati to start fresh, to try to forget what I had seen in that journal. And then 2 months ago, my sister read me a newspaper article about the discovery at the Thornton farm, about Samuel found deceased in his chair, about 3 girls missing and then found buried beneath the barn. And I knew. God help me. I knew I could have prevented it if I had just been brave enough to speak up. Martha broke down completely then, her sobs echoing through the small apartment. Brennan sat in silence, his own throat tight with emotion. Another person who had seen the warning signs, another person who had been silenced by society's unwillingness to believe that evil could hide behind respectability. After Martha had composed herself, Brennan asked one final question. "In those last months you were there, did the girls know what their father was becoming? Did they understand the danger they were in?" Martha wiped her eyes and thought carefully before answering. "I think they knew he was getting worse, but I don't think they could have imagined what he was truly planning. How could anyone imagine such a thing? But I remember something Esther said to me the week before I left. We were in the kitchen, and Samuel was outside working in the barn. Esther came up to me and whispered, 'Martha, if something happens to us, if we disappear, promise me you'll tell people it wasn't our choice. Promise me you'll tell them we wanted to live.' I asked her what she meant, and she just shook her head and walked away. At the time, I thought she was being dramatic, that she was just unhappy with her father's strict rules. But now I understand. She knew. Somehow she knew her father was capable of something terrible, but she was trapped with no way to escape. Brennan returned to Mercy Hollow with Martha's testimony weighing heavily on his heart. He had all the pieces now, a complete picture of how a man's mind could twist religious devotion into something monstrous, how isolation and obsession could transform protective love into a fatal prison. He spent the next week writing his final report on the Thornton case. It was the most difficult document he had ever composed, trying to explain the unexplainable, trying to find reason in madness. He detailed Samuel Thornton's deteriorating mental state, the warning signs that had been missed or ignored, and the tragic inevitability of what had happened. But what haunted Brennan more than anything was the timeline he had reconstructed of the girl's final days. Based on the evidence, Samuel had likely begun sedating his daughters gradually, increasing the doses of laudanum in their evening tea over the course of several weeks. This would explain why no one in town had seen them in the months before their deaths. They would have been too drowsy, too confused to function normally. On what was probably the first week of December 1931, Samuel had given them a final massive dose of laudanum in their dinner. As the girls became unconscious, he had changed them into the white nightgowns he had prepared and carried them one by one to the underground chamber he had spent months constructing beneath the barn floor. The medical evidence suggested they had still been alive when he sealed them in, but deeply unconscious. They would have simply stopped breathing as the laudanum depressed their respiratory systems, drifting from sleep into death without ever waking. It was, in Samuel's twisted logic, a mercy. He believed he was sending them to heaven pure and untouched, sparing them from the corruption and sin he was convinced awaited them in the world. After sealing his daughter's tomb, Samuel had returned to his house and waited for death to claim him as well. The guilt and stress of what he had done had triggered a fatal heart episode, and he had died in his rocking chair, still believing he had done the right thing. Sheriff Brennan closed the case file on April 15, 1932, 3 months after the initial discovery. The official ruling was clear. Samuel Thornton had taken the lives of his 3 daughters while suffering from severe delusional disorder and religious mania, then had died of natural causes brought on by extreme psychological distress. But for the people of Mercy Hollow, the case would never truly be closed. The white farmhouse stood empty for years, no one willing to buy property soaked in such tragedy. Children whispered that it was haunted, that on quiet winter nights you could hear 3 girls singing hymns from somewhere beneath the earth. Thomas Webb never married. He lived alone until his death in 1967 and requested in his will to be buried next to Ruth Thornton's grave, finally able to keep the promise he had made to her so many years before. Miss Caroline Porter left teaching after the tragedy, unable to shake the guilt of not doing more to help Naomi. She became a child welfare advocate, dedicating the rest of her life to creating systems that would protect children from dangerous home situations. Martha Simmons never returned to Mercy Hollow. She lived in Cincinnati for the rest of her life, carrying the burden of her silence like a physical weight. Before she died in 1958, she donated a significant portion of her savings to establish a shelter for women and children escaping dangerous family situations. And Sheriff Thomas Brennan, who had seen horrors in the trenches of France, but had never encountered anything as soul-crushing as the Thornton case, made it his mission to ensure such a tragedy never happened again in his county. He pushed for reforms that would allow law enforcement to intervene when credible concerns were raised about children's safety, even in private family matters. The Thornton case became a grim lesson about the dangers of isolation, the warning signs of mental illness left untreated, and the terrible price of society's unwillingness to look too closely into the private affairs of seemingly respectable families. Ruth, Esther, and Naomi Thornton were buried together in Mercy Hollow Cemetery, beneath a shared headstone that reads simply, "3 sisters, together forever, taken too soon. May God grant them the freedom they never had in life." Their story remains one of the most disturbing cold cases in American history, not because it was never solved, but because it was solved too late. The truth was there all along, hidden behind closed doors and respectability, waiting for someone brave enough to see it and act on it. And in the end, the real tragedy wasn't just what Samuel Thornton did to his daughters, but what everyone else failed to do to save them. The end. This story is based on historical patterns of family tragedies during the Great Depression era, when mental health resources were virtually non-existent and societal norms prevented intervention in family matters. While this specific case is a dramatized narrative, it reflects the very real dangers of untreated mental illness, isolation, and the failure of communities to protect their most vulnerable members.